The stagecoach wheels grinding against Wyoming dirt sounded like bones breaking, and Jake Thornwood knew his life was about to shatter into something unrecognizable. His mail-order bride would take one look at the melted ruin of his face, those scars that made children cry and grown men look away, and she'd climb right back on that coach. But what arrived in Copper Ridge that October morning wasn't disgust or rejection. It was silence. A silence so complete it would teach a lonely rancher that the most profound connections happen when words fail. When two broken souls discover that real communication has nothing to do with sound and everything to do with understanding the language of survival, of touch, of hearts that refuse to surrender. Before we dive into the story, I want you to imagine being completely alone for 3 years, wondering if anyone could ever love you again. This story will change how you think about human connection forever. Click the like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss these powerful stories. And please, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love knowing that people all around the world are sharing these moments together. Now let's continue with the story. Jake pressed the worn letter against his chest one more time before the stagecoach rolled into view. Sarah Matthews had seemed perfect on paper. A schoolteacher from Boston, 26 years old, seeking a new life out west. Her letters spoke of adventure and companionship, of building something together. She'd never asked about his appearance, and he'd never offered the truth about the fire that had claimed half his face 3 years ago when he'd rushed into a burning barn to save his horses. The left side looked like candle wax left too close to flame, pink and rippled and wrong. The coach door opened, and Jake straightened his shoulders, trying to angle his good side forward. A small woman stepped down, wearing a simple, blue traveling dress. Her dark hair was pinned beneath a practical bonnet, and her eyes were the color of sage honey. Beautiful, he thought, before the familiar ache settled in. Too beautiful for a monster. Miss Matthews? He removed his hat, forgetting his practiced angle, exposing his scars fully to the morning Sunday. I'm Jake Thornwood. She stared at him, those honey eyes wide, but her expression wasn't horror. It was something else. Confusion, maybe? She didn't speak, didn't move, just looked from his face to his lips and back again. I know I'm not what you expected, Jake began, his voice rough with prepared apology. If you want to leave, I'll pay for your passage back. She stepped closer, not away. Her hand rose toward his face, then stopped, moved to her ear instead. She shook her head firmly, pointed to her ears, then opened her mouth, and no sound came. Her hands moved in graceful, desperate patterns he couldn't understand. The truth hit him like a stampede. She couldn't hear him, couldn't hear anything. This wasn't Sarah Matthews at all. The woman fumbled in her traveling bag, pulling out a slate board and chalk. Her hands trembled as she wrote, and Jake noticed old scars circling her wrists like bracelets made of pain. She held up the board. Clara Bellwether. Sarah got consumption. Died 2 weeks ago. She begged me to take her place. Said you were a good man who needed help. I need safety. Please. Jake stared at the words until they blurred. His carefully planned future had just derailed, yet something in those honey eyes held him steady. Desperation recognized desperation, maybe. Or maybe loneliness had its own language that didn't need sound. The stagecoach driver coughed impatiently. You keeping her or sending her back, Thornwood? I got schedules to keep. Jake looked at Clara, this stranger who traveled 2,000 miles on a dead woman's promise. Her chin lifted slightly, proud despite her plea. He thought about his empty house, the silence that pressed against him every night, like a living thing. At least with her, the silence would have company. He reached for her bags. The driver shrugged and clicked his tongue, wheels rolling away in a cloud of dust that made Clara sneeze. The sound was odd, uncontrolled, like she couldn't hear herself. She covered her mouth, embarrassed, and Jake found himself almost smiling. When was the last time he'd done that? At the ranch, Clara walked through his house slowly, running her fingers along surfaces like she was reading stories in the wood grain. She stopped at the kitchen table, wrote on her slate, You built this? Jake nodded. and she traced the smooth corners with something like appreciation. She moved to the window, studied the view of the pastures, then wrote again. "That fence post. Third from left. It's loose." He squinted where she pointed. Damn if she wasn't right. How had she noticed what he'd missed for weeks? Clara cooked that night while Jake watched, mesmerized by how she tested temperature with her wrist, how she felt the potatoes to know when they were done. The meal was simple but somehow tasted of memory, of his mother's kitchen before the war took his father and grief took her. Clara watched him eat, saw something in his expression and wrote, "My mother taught me, before the fever took my hearing. I remember, through my hands." After dinner, she showed him more scars, not just her wrists, but thin lines across her palms where she'd fought restraints. She wrote in careful letters, "My sister's husband said I was broken, locked me in Massachusetts State Asylum, 2 years. Sarah was my nurse. She helped me escape. Gave me her chance because she was dying anyway." Jake's scarred hand moved across the table, not touching hers, but close. He understood cages. His was just made of mirrors and people's stares instead of walls. Clara wrote one more thing before bed. "I'm not broken, are you?" Jake thought about it long after she'd taken the spare room. He traced his own scars in the darkness. Maybe broken things could still be useful. Maybe they could even be something more. When sleep finally came, the house felt different. Still quiet, but no longer empty. Clara's presence changed the quality of the silence itself. Teaching a deaf woman to shoot should have been impossible, but Clara placed her palm flat against the rifle stock and felt for the vibration. Jake watched her eyes focus on something beyond sight, reading the weapon's readiness through her skin. When she fired, hitting the tin can on her third try, her face lit with a smile that made Jake's scarred cheek ache with an answering grin he couldn't quite suppress. She taught him signs that first week. Simple ones. Horse, danger, food, home. Her hands shaped meaning from air, and Jake's calloused fingers struggled to follow. But when Clara signed "thank you" by touching her chin and extending her hand toward him, something loosened in his chest that had been tight since the fire. The wolves came on the 5th night. Jake woke to find Clara standing at the window, her hand pressed against the glass. She turned to him, eyes wide, and signed something frantic he didn't understand. Then she grabbed his hand, placed it on the window. He felt it then, the subtle vibration of howling he couldn't hear from inside. She'd felt them coming through the bones of the house. By morning, they'd lost no cattle. Clara had spotted the pack circling long before they attacked, using a mirror to flash sunlight in Jake's eyes from across the pasture. Together, they'd driven the wolves off, working in strange harmony. She watched. He listened. And somehow, they'd become more than the sum of their parts. Clara wrote extensively that evening, explaining what Jake had begun to suspect. She experienced the world differently, not less. She showed him how she could feel a horse's mood through the ground when it walked, how changes in air pressure told her about coming weather. She'd learned to read lips when people spoke slowly, facing her directly. "I lost my hearing to scarlet fever when I was 7, she wrote. "My parents loved me anyway. They learned signs, found teachers. Then they died in a carriage accident when I was 18. My sister Margaret got everything because her husband Edmund convinced a judge I was incompetent. The asylum was his solution to sharing inheritance." Jake studied her face as she wrote, seeing strength where others saw disability. That night, he asked her to teach him more signs. She started with beautiful, which made her laugh silently and shake her head. Then strong. Then safe. When she taught him stay, her hands moved slower, careful, like she was asking a question. He answered by learning to sign yes. They developed a system for nighttime. 2 taps on the floor meant horses were restless. 3 meant human approach. A long press meant danger. Clara slept with her hand on the wall, feeling the house's breathing. Jake had never felt safer, which made no sense. How could a woman who couldn't hear make him feel protected? But watching her navigate his world with such grace, teaching him to see through her eyes, Jake understood something that would have seemed impossible a week ago. Clara heard things he was deaf to, the language of observation, of attention, of bodies speaking truth when words lied. She heard the world's hidden rhythms, felt its secret heartbeat, and somehow, without a single spoken word between them, she was teaching him to hear it too. The general store smelled of molasses and judgment. Mrs. Garrett, who'd smiled at Jake just last month, looked at Clara like she was plague-touched. When Clara pointed to the flower and held out her money, the shopkeeper stepped back as if death was catching. "We don't serve the afflicted, Mrs." Garrett announced loudly, as if volume could pierce Clara's condition. "It's bad luck. Bad for business." Clara watched the woman's lips, understanding every poisonous word. She turned to Jake and signed something he'd learned that week. "It's fine. I'm used to this." But it wasn't fine. Jake's scarred hand clenched into a fist. "She's my wife, Mrs. Garrett. You'll serve her like anyone else." "Your wife?" The shopkeeper's laugh was ugly. "You can't marry someone who can't even say, 'I do,' Jake Thornwood. What kind of marriage is that?" Clara touched Jake's arm gently, then wrote on her slate with steady hands, "I've fought this battle before. Save your strength for fights that matter." She pulled him toward the door, dignity wrapped around her like armor. Outside, 3 boys threw pebbles at a dog. When they saw Jake, one whispered loud enough to carry, "Look, it's the melted man." Another made a grotesque face, pulling his cheek down. They laughed until they saw Clara watching. Then they ran, somehow more afraid of her silence than Jake's scars. That evening, Pastor Williams visited. He sat uncomfortably in their kitchen, refusing Clara's tea, addressing only Jake. "I've heard about your situation, son. This arrangement, it's not proper, not blessed. I can help you annul this false marriage, find you a real bride. Someone whole." Clara read his lips from across the room, her hands stilled on the dish she was drying. Jake saw her shoulders set, that same pride from the stagecoach platform. "Someone whole?" Jake's voice came out dangerous and low. "Tell me, Pastor, what makes a person whole? Is it their ears, their skin, or is it something else?" The pastor fumbled with his hat. "God made us in his image, Jake. We shouldn't accept broken versions." Clara moved then, graceful and deliberate. She set down her dish and wrote on her slate, showing it to the pastor. "Which of us did God make wrong? The woman who cannot hear cruel words, or the man who speaks them in a house of love?" Pastor Williams left without answering. That night, Clara found Jake sitting on the porch, staring at stars that didn't judge. She sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. In the moonlight, she traced his scars with her fingertips, gentle as butterfly wings. Then she lifted his hand to her throat, placing it where her own scars were hidden beneath her collar. She unbuttoned just enough to show him the ring of damaged skin where asylum orderlies had held her down for force-feeding when she'd refused to eat. They sat like that, her hand on his ruined face, his on her scarred throat, understanding passing between them like electricity. 2 people the world called broken, finding wholeness in each other's damaged places. Clara signed slowly, teaching him as she went. "They, see, wrong, we, are, not broken, we, are, surviving." Jake signed back, clumsy but certain. Together. Clara stood in the middle of the pasture, with her arms spread wide, eyes closed, feeling something Jake couldn't perceive. She'd been doing this for 10 minutes while he repaired the fence, and he was about to ask if she was all right when she suddenly opened her eyes and signed urgently, "Storm. Big." 2 days. Jake looked at the cloudless blue sky and almost laughed. But Clara was already moving, pointing at things he needed to secure. She showed him how the horses stood differently, how the birds flew lower than usual. She pressed his hand to the ground, and after a moment, he felt it too, something restless in the earth itself. By evening, clouds gathered on the horizon like an army. By the next morning, ranchers from neighboring spreads were riding over, asking Jake how he'd known to prepare. He pointed to Clara, who was helping him move the cattle to shelter. They looked at her with new eyes, confused but curious. The storm hit exactly when Clara had predicted. Wind like screaming demons, rain that fell sideways, lightning that turned night to terrible day. The horses panicked in the barn, and Jake couldn't calm them alone. But Clara walked among them fearlessly, her hands on their necks, feeling their terror through their trembling. She breathed slowly, deliberately, and somehow the horses began matching her rhythm. She couldn't hear their frightened neighing, but she could feel their hearts racing through her palms and knew exactly how to soothe them. Jake watched her work, this woman who heard the world through her skin and bones. When thunder crashed overhead, she didn't flinch. When lightning struck a tree nearby, she felt it through her feet and simply adjusted her stance. The storm that terrified him was just another kind of information to her. After the worst passed, she showed him her journal, pages and pages of observations Jake would never have noticed. How beetles moved before rain, how chickens laid eggs differently before temperature changes, how the ranch dog's fur stood up 12 hours before visitors arrived. She'd been watching, learning, creating a map of the world that had nothing to do with sound. You see everything, Jake signed, proud that he could manage that much without speaking. Clara smiled and corrected him with gentle hands, teaching him a new sign. Feel. I feel everything. She taught him to read the world her way. How to stand barefoot and sense approaching riders through ground vibrations. How to watch shadows to know when hawks circled overhead. How to put his hand on a horse's side and understand its mood through muscle tension. Jake had lived on this land for 6 years, but Clara was showing him he'd been blind to half of it. That night, she wrote him a longer message. The asylum doctor said I was broken because I couldn't hear. They never understood that when you lose one sense, the others grow stronger. I learned to see time and how light changes, to feel music through floorboards when others danced, to know when someone lies because their shoulders tell truth, their mouths won't. You think you saved me by letting me stay, but Jake, I'm teaching you to hear the world's secret language. We're saving each other. Jake read it twice, then signed the new word she'd taught him that morning. Partner. Edmund Hartley's boots were too clean for Wyoming dirt, and his smile was the kind that never reached his eyes. He stood at Jake's door like he owned it, with Sheriff Morrison beside him and papers that looked official enough to ruin lives. Clara had felt the unfamiliar horses through the floorboards and was already pale when she saw him. Her whole body changed, shrinking into itself like a rabbit sensing a wolf. She signed frantically to Jake, but these weren't the careful teaching signs she'd shown him. These were desperate, wild gestures that needed no translation. Pure terror had its own language. My dear sister-in-law, Edmund said smoothly, though he faced away from Clara when he spoke, making lip-reading impossible. I've come to take you home where you belong. The asylum is missing their most troubled patient. Jake stepped between them. She's not going anywhere with you. Edmund's laugh was cultured and cold. I'm afraid you don't understand, Mr. Thornwood. Clara is legally incompetent. I have guardianship papers, signed by a Boston judge. Any marriage between you is invalid since she cannot consent. She's mentally deficient. Clara's hand found Jake's sleeve, gripping tight enough to hurt. She pulled him back, grabbed her slate, and wrote with shaking hands. He killed them. Jake read the words, confused. Edmund snatched the slate before Clara could write more, throwing it against the wall where it shattered. See how violent she becomes? These fits are why she needs professional care. Sheriff Morrison looked uncomfortable but stepped forward. Jake, if he's got legal papers, I have to enforce them. You know that. Clara dropped to her knees, not in surrender, but to write in the dust on the floor with her finger. Carriage accident, not accident. He did it for money. Edmund's polished boot swept through the words, erasing them. The fever destroyed her mind along with her hearing. She invents terrible stories. It's part of her condition. Then let her write them all, Jake said. Let the sheriff see what she has to say. The ravings of a lunatic prove nothing. Edmund produced more papers from his coat. These are from the Massachusetts State Asylum. Diagnosis of hysteria, delusions, and violent tendencies. She attacked an orderly, Mr. Thornwood. bit through his hand like an animal. Is that who you want in your bed? Clara stood slowly, dignity gathering around her like a storm. She walked to Jake's shelf, pulled down his Bible, and opened to where she'd pressed a letter weeks ago. With steady hands, she gave it to the sheriff. Her mother's handwriting, dated just before the accident. If something happens to us, don't let Edmund near Clara. He's already taken so much. She's not mad. She's just deaf. But he needs her inheritance, and he'll say anything to get it. Morrison read it, frowning. This is concerning, Mr. Hartley. A forgery, Edmund said quickly. Clara's quite clever with her hands. It's part of what makes her so dangerous. She can mimic anything. Clara signed to Jake, slow enough for him to understand. I am not property. I am your wife. Jake's scarred hand covered hers. Sheriff, this woman tends my ranch, predicts storms, saves my cattle. She reads, writes, manages accounts. How is that incompetent? Because she cannot hear God's word, Edmund snapped, his composure finally cracking. She's cursed, broken, useless except for the money my late brother left her. The truth hung in the air like gun smoke. Even Morrison looked disgusted. But Edmund composed himself, straightened his coat. Nevertheless, I have legal documents. She comes with me today, or I return with federal marshals. Your choice, mister. Thornwood. The trading post owner, Samuel Crow Feather, rarely involved himself in town disputes, but he stood in Jake's parlor now with his daughter Mary, who'd been deaf since birth. Mary's hands moved like water as she signed with Clara, two women speaking a language that needed no sound. Samuel translated, his voice carrying the weight of mountains. Clara has been teaching Mary to read and write. First person to treat my daughter like she has a mind worth educating. He looked at Sheriff Morrison. You want to arrest someone for helping children, Sheriff? Word had spread through Copper Ridge like wildfire. Tom Patterson, whose ranch bordered Jake's, arrived next. That woman warned me about a flash flood 3 days before it hit. Saved my entire herd. She saw something in how the creek was running that I missed for 20 years. Even Mrs. Garrett came, grudgingly, her grandson Timothy hiding behind her skirts. The boy stepped forward, signing clumsily to Clara, who smiled and corrected his hand positions gently. She's been teaching him, Mrs. Garrett admitted. Timothy stutters so bad he won't talk to nobody. But with his hands, with her signs, he can say anything. First time I seen him confident. The blacksmith, Augustus Johnson, pushed through the crowd. She kept my forge from burning down the whole street. Noticed heat patterns in the metal that weren't right. I don't care if she can't hear. She sees things others don't. Edmund's face grew redder with each testimony. None of this matters. I have legal guardianship. Boston court authority supersedes your frontier sentiment. Jake had been studying Edmund's papers while others talked. Years of land contracts had taught him to spot forgeries, and something about the seal looked wrong. Sheriff, look at this date. Clara's parents died in March of 1880. These guardianship papers are dated February of that year. Morrison examined them closely. He got guardianship before they died? Unless he knew they were going to die, Jake said quietly. Edmund lunged for the papers, but Clara moved faster. She'd been watching his lips, reading his body language, and she knew violence before it formed. Her hand shot out, catching his wrist, twisting with a strength born of asylum struggles. Edmund yelped and stumbled back. See, violence! She's dangerous, he shouted. Clara stood perfectly still, then began signing. Mary translated for her father, who spoke her words. I am not violent. I am survivor. You locked me in darkness, fed me spoiled food, tied me to beds, said I was animal because I could not hear. But I remember everything. Every document you forged, every lie you told, every dollar you stole. She pulled another paper from her dress, one she'd hidden for weeks. This is real will, parents' real will, hidden in Mother's Bible. Everything to me, nothing to Margaret's husband. You married my sister for money that was mine. The room went silent. Edmund's composure shattered completely. That's impossible. I destroyed. That's obviously fake. Sheriff Morrison had seen enough. "Mr. Hartley, I think you need to come with me. We'll have the territorial judge review everything when he arrives next week." "This is mistake," Edmund snarled. "She's an animal who can't even speak." Clara walked to him slowly, placed her hand on her throat, and with enormous effort, shaped a single word with her voice. It came out rough, unpracticed, but clear enough. Free. The word hung in the air like a challenge, like a victory, like a declaration of war. She'd probably practiced it 1,000 times in secret, saved it for the moment it would matter most. Jake had never heard her voice before, might never hear it again, but that one word was enough. It said everything. Judge Harrison Blackwood had seen plenty of frontier justice, but nothing quite like the deaf woman who stood before him, hands moving like poetry while her husband translated. The makeshift courtroom in the town hall overflowed with citizens who'd never cared about legal proceedings before this day. Edmund had hired a lawyer from Denver, Mr. Cornelius Wade, whose opening statement dripped condescension. "Your Honor, we're discussing whether someone who cannot hear God's word, cannot speak her marriage vows, cannot call for help in danger, can possibly consent to marriage or manage property. The asylum's diagnosis is clear: hysteria, delusions, violent tendencies." Clara signed steadily to Jake, who spoke her words. "Your Honor, I request to defend myself." "Test my competency yourself. Ask me anything." Judge Blackwood leaned forward, intrigued. "Can you calculate the interest on a $1,000 loan at 8% over 3 years?" Clara didn't hesitate. She wrote on a slate the court provided. $240. But if compounded annually, $259.71. Explain the legal difference between guardianship and conservatorship. She wrote quickly, clearly, showing understanding that surprised even the judge. Then she added, "I studied law books in the asylum library. The doctors never knew I could read. They never asked." The judge presented increasingly complex tests: geography, mathematics, literature, history. Clara answered them all, her education evident despite years of imprisonment. When he asked about ranch management, she detailed crop rotation, cattle breeding schedules, weather patterns, and financial planning that impressed the ranchers in attendance. "Mr. Wade," the judge said, "your client claims she's incompetent. I'm seeing evidence of an educated, intelligent woman." Wade scrambled. "Intelligence and competency aren't the same, Your Honor. She cannot function in society. She cannot hear danger approaching. She cannot communicate normally." Clara stood suddenly, walked to the window, and placed her hand on the glass. Then she signed rapidly to Jake, who looked outside and said, "She says there are 3 riders approaching from the east. They'll arrive in about 2 minutes." Everyone waited. In exactly 2 minutes, 3 horses appeared on the eastern road. The courtroom buzzed with amazement. Clara signed again, and Jake translated, "I feel vibrations through the ground, changes in air pressure, shifts in light. I perceive things hearing people miss because they rely on only one sense for warning. As for communication, I'm doing it now. Through my husband, through writing, through signs that many in this room now understand." She walked to Timothy, Mrs. Garrett's grandson, and signed to him. The boy signed back, then spoke aloud, his stutter barely noticeable. She says being different doesn't mean broken. Mary Crowfeather signed next, her father translating. "Clara taught me to write my name." No one else tried. Judge Blackwood held up his hand for silence. "Mr. Hartley, explain these guardianship papers dated before your in-law's death." Edmund stuttered. "Clerical error. The clerk must have. And this will Clara present it stating everything goes to her? Forgery. She's clever with her hands." Clara produced another document from her bag, handing it to the judge. "What's this?" Blackwood asked. Jake read it and translated Clara's signs. "Letter from Boston police. They investigated the carriage accident after I escaped. Brake lines were cut. Edmund owed money to dangerous people. My parents' death paid his debts." The courtroom erupted. Edmund jumped up, shouting, Lies! All lies! You can't believe a madwoman who— Who what? Judge Blackwood's voice cut through the chaos. Who survived 2 years of illegal imprisonment? Who manages a ranch better than most men? Who predicted the storm that saved half this county's cattle? Who taught children to communicate when no one else would? He stood, decision made. This marriage is valid. The guardianship is revoked. Mr. Hartley, you're under arrest for fraud, false imprisonment, and suspicion of murder. Edmund had made bail and disappeared for 3 weeks before Clara felt the horses panic through the barn floor at midnight. She pressed her hand against Jake's chest, their signal for human danger, then held up 4 fingers. 4 riders. Her eyes said the rest. This is bad. Jake reached for his rifle, but Clara caught his wrist, signed, Trap. They want you to come out shooting. She'd been watching the shadows move wrong all day, feeling vibrations that didn't match normal ranch patterns. She'd tried to warn him earlier, but even their language had limits. The outlaws Edmund hired were professionals, not local thugs. They moved like smoke, expecting an easy kidnapping of a deaf woman and a scarred rancher. They didn't expect Clara to have rigged mirrors throughout the house, letting her see around corners through reflections. They didn't expect Jake to understand her tactical signs, developed over months of working together. The first outlaw crept through the kitchen door, gun drawn. Clara couldn't hear his footsteps, but she felt the floorboards shift. She signed to Jake from across the room. Now. Jake's rifle butt caught the man's temple perfectly. 1 down. The second came through the window. Clara had deliberately left unlatched, falling into their trap. She'd spread flour on the floor, invisible in darkness, but perfect for tracking movement. When he stepped in it, she knew exactly where he was. Her cast iron pan connected with his skull before he knew she was there. The third was smarter, trying to smoke them out by setting the barn on fire. But Clara had expected this, had moved the horses earlier when she'd felt the wrongness in the air. The empty barn burned, but the animals were safe. Jake used the fire's light to spot the arsonist, dropping him with a single shot to the shoulder. The fourth was Edmund himself, desperate and wild-eyed, holding papers. "Sign these!" He screamed at Clara, though she couldn't hear him. "Sign over your inheritance or I'll kill him!" He had his gun pointed at Jake, not seeing Clara position herself behind him. She moved in his blind spot, silent as death itself. But Edmund was paranoid now, spinning at the last second, his gun swinging toward her. The floor vibrated with Jake's footstep, warning her. Clara dropped flat as Jake's knife flew over her, catching Edmund's gun hand. The weapon fell, and Clara kicked it away. Edmund scrambled for it, but Clara was faster. She'd learned to fight in the asylum, learned that survival meant being quicker than cruelty. She didn't need to hear Edmund's curses as Sheriff Morrison and his deputies arrived, summoned by the barn fire's glow. She didn't need to hear his threats as they dragged him away. She only needed to feel Jake's arms around her, his heart beating against her palm, both of them alive and whole. They found Edmund's forged papers scattered in the dirt. Transfer documents for Clara's inheritance. A false death certificate claiming she'd died in the asylum. Even a bill of sale for the ranch. Edmund had planned to take everything, leave no witnesses. He underestimated you. Jake signed to Clara as they watched the sun rise over their saved land. Clara signed back, adding new words he didn't know yet, teaching him as she went. He saw weakness where there was strength. He heard silence where there was language. He thought broken meant helpless. She paused, then added, "We taught him different." Jake understood every word, even the ones he'd never seen before. Their language had grown beyond signs and touches. It lived in how they moved together, fought together, survived together. It was written in trust, spelled out in scars that matched, spoken in the silence they shared. 6 months had passed since Edmund's arrest, and Clara's belly curved with new life beneath her apron as she taught the Sunday signing class. Jake watched from the doorway as 15 townsfolk, ranging from Timothy Garrett to old Augustus Johnson, moved their hands in careful conversation. Even Mrs. Garrett had apologized, her fingers now fluid in the language she'd once feared. The ranch had transformed under Clara's observations. She'd identified underground water by watching where deer gathered in drought. She'd predicted a harsh winter by reading woolly caterpillar stripes and bird migration patterns, helping neighbors prepare and save hundreds of cattle. The woman they'd called cursed had become their blessing. At night, Clara would place Jake's hand on her stomach, letting him feel the baby move. She taught him signs for the future they were building: daughter, son, lullaby, love, forever. Her journal now included sketches of baby clothes, crib designs, and lists of names written in her careful script. Doc Henderson confirmed what Clara had felt through her body's changes. The baby was healthy, strong, due in spring when the wildflowers bloomed. "You'll need to teach that child both languages," he'd said, no longer questioning their marriage, but admiring it. Speaking and signing, best of both worlds. Jake had built a new room for the baby, and Clara had sewn curtains that would move with breeze, creating patterns for their child to watch. She'd already begun planning how to teach a hearing child to see the world through her eyes, feel it through her awareness. One evening, as they sat on the porch Jake had widened to fit 2 rocking chairs, Clara did something she'd been practicing in secret for months. She placed his weathered hand on her throat and shaped words with her voice, rusty from years of silence but clear with determination. "I love you, Jake." Tears ran down Jake's scarred cheek. He'd never expected to hear her voice again after that single "free" in the courtroom. She'd been working with Mary Crow Feather, who'd been deaf since birth but had learned some speech before the fever took her hearing. Together, they'd been teaching each other to shape sound they couldn't hear. Jake signed back, then spoke slowly so she could read his lips. "You taught me to hear with my heart, Clara. You showed me that real communication isn't about sound. It's about understanding, about feeling, about choosing to learn each other's language." Clara wrote on, the slate she still carried, though they needed it less now. "I came here running from a world that couldn't hear me. I found a man who listens with his whole being. Our child will know both worlds, Jake. Silence and sound. They'll be complete in ways we never could be alone." Spring arrived with their daughter's first cry, a sound Clara felt through the vibration in Jake's chest as he held them both. They named her Sarah, after the woman whose death had given them life. Sarah would grow up bilingual in love's many languages, signing before she could speak, seeing the world through her mother's awareness and her father's newfound sensitivity. The town doctor predicted Sarah might be deaf like her mother, or scarred like her father, but Clara and Jake knew better. Their daughter was perfect, not despite their differences, but because of them. She would know that broken people could build whole families, that silence could speak louder than words, that scars were just proof of survival. As Jake watched Clara sign lullabies to their daughter, her hands dancing in the lamplight, he realized the truth. He'd ordered a bride to ease his loneliness, but had received something infinitely more precious: a teacher, a warrior. A woman who'd shown him that the most profound connections happen when conventional communication fails, when 2 souls learn to speak a language made entirely of understanding, trust, and the choice to stay. Clara had been right that first night. They weren't broken, they were transformed. And in the gentle Wyoming twilight, as their daughter grasped both their fingers with tiny, perfect hands, their love needed no words at all. It lived in every gesture, every touch, every shared glance across their kitchen table. They'd built a language all their own, and it would echo through generations. Thank you for joining me on this emotional journey. If this story touched your heart, click the like button and subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow I'll share another powerful tale that will remind you that love speaks in ways beyond words. Until then, remember that our differences don't make us broken, they make us human.